Welcome to Video Game Genres, where your host Gexup provides you information you need to know about a certain number of video games put in a category. And tonight's episode of Video Game Genre is Survival Horror. At times when we feel uncomfortable, or at a state of feeling threatened, helpless, or never knowing what's going to happen, this drives out mankind's oldest emotion, fear. We all had this emotion of being scared one time or the other. Many never want to be at a state of shock or at a state of paranoia due to feeling uncomfortable or having health problems in fearful situations. But for some, feeling scared gets them excited and enjoy themselves just as long as it doesn't kill them. That's the reason why many people love going to haunted houses, read horror books, and go see a horror movie, because to them, the love of being scared is excitement. And this is the reason why horror media to this day is so successful. But nowadays, there's not that many horror movies that are as scary as before, because to me, they ran out of ideas of making original scares and oversaturated violence as it's disturbing and painful to watch, rather than giving us an experience that will give us nightmares. But there is one horror media that I go to when I want excitement for horror that movies and books no longer has to offer. It's video games. Horror in video games has a unique relationship as they implement together very well, where it's not independent as a viewer like movies, but rather it directly involves the player. Since the player controls the character, they literally connect with the character. With everything thrown at them, the player reacts trying to fulfill the object of the game. Whatever happens to the character affects the player. But adding horrors and scare in video games, you got yourself the suspense of disbelief and terror. It creates its own genre called survival horror. But years before the term survival horror was used, there were scares and horror in video games. One of the earliest horror games is Haunted House for the Atari 2600, released in 1981. The gameplay emphasizes on puzzle solving and evasive action rather than violence. The game uses monsters commonly featured in horror fiction, such as bats and ghosts. The gameplay incorporates item collecting and inventory management, along with areas inaccessible until the appropriate item is found. Because it has several features that has been seen in many survival horror games, Haunted House is the first in the genre, and many in that genre took the influence of puzzle solving and surviving the horrors. Since then, text-based PC games brought plenty of scares, and then point-and-click adventure games on the PC caught up with the concept with horror in video games into a new level. In 1986, two games called Uninvited and Chiller came to the PC, and later ported to the NES, when it was one of, if not the first horror games that implemented horrific imagery and atmosphere, which is the most important part in horror video games. And without it, it wouldn't be as scary as it is today. Thanks to Uninvited and Chiller, scares in video games now has a brighter future. For Uninvited, it innovated having an inventory system, as it is important not only to adventure games, but as well survival horror. Later adventure games like Elvira, The Mistress of the Dark, Elvira 2, Dark Seed, Clock Tower, and I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream continues the scares as gaming continues to evolve. In 1995, yet it was nothing new in terms of changing the point-and-click adventure genre, Clock Tower created a new type of scares where the main character, Jennifer, was unable to attack or defend herself when all she can do is run, hide in a hiding spot, or get Scissors Man out of her sight. Clock Tower has over 9 endings, where it's one of the first games that allows choosing your own path. This is another important element which is borrowed from games like Silent Hill. Also, as movies became marketable in video games, horror movies like Alien, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, and more brought more horror in video games. As well, it was a horror that they were all terrible to play. But really good classics like Castlevania and Splatterhouse had action in it that had scared plenty of gamers back in the day with its atmosphere. When CD-ROMs were a major technical leap in the 90s, full motion video came and went, making new scares with FMVs like Seventh Guest, Gabriel Knight 2, Phantasmagoria, D, and more. Another new and innovative scares in video games were first-person shooters, as they were a great genre for horror, with games like Doom, Isle of the Dead, and System Shock. They all brought gamers in a world of hell, and for Doom's case, it was literally in hell. Games like Doom scared hundreds of gamers with its satanic design and demons to face, which brought a huge fan base and controversy to the public. Yep, these were the days where games were scary for the time. But since those games are not quote-unquote survival horror games, I just want to briefly talk about them because there's more to horror video games than survival horror, and we should never forget that they scared a lot of people in those days. Now let's get to survival horror. Things really started to change when games were heading to 3D. In 1992, Infogame has created a new adventure horror genre, and that game is Alone in the Dark. and this game was unlike anything we have never seen before. Rather than using a mouse to point and click, players now use a keyboard interface with fixed camera angles and pre-rendered background in which later survival horror games had borrowed. This game wasn't always heavily focused on puzzle solving, but rather, you can protect yourself from monsters by being able to shoot and attack with whatever weapon you wield. This became a new approach in playing games in general, as it's offering control of speed, health, and ammunition, in which it creates an overall intention of playing games years to come. Alone in the Dark was the pioneer of survival horror genre, and without it, we would never know what would horror games look like today. Then in 1996, Capcom has released Biohazard, or in America, Resident Evil. It popularized horror games in general, despite the fact that the game took influence from other games that I already mentioned. What made Resident Evil a memorable classic is that the scares terrified many people, in which to this day would make anybody jump in the most unexpected moments. To this day, many people would say that Resident Evil took a lot of influence from Alone in the Dark, but according to Capcom, Resident Evil originated from another survival horror for the Nintendo Entertainment System called Sweet Home, released in 1989. The term survival horror was first used by Capcom to market Resident Evil. Rather than just calling it a horror game, the word survival focuses on the character we control, and our objective is to keep our character alive, as we do in almost every video game. But we don't call other genres survival platformer or survival fighting because it's obvious that's the way that they were meant to be played. It's just that the subgenre of an action game gets the player thrilled that survival is the main focus. But keep in mind that not all horror games are survival horror. There are other genres that are using horror elements that are as well scary. It's just that survival horror separates from other horror games before it because it's an adventure genre mixed with action gameplay. Resident Evil was so popular and revolutionary that it popularized scares in video games. From zombie dogs crashing through windows, from zombies climbing out of the closet, and not knowing what's behind the door became an instant classic. Thus, more Resident Evil games were released, making even more scares with Resident Evil 2 facing zombies in Raccoon City, and Resident Evil 3 returning to the city with Nemesis haunting you. Thus, more survival horror games like Dino Crisis, which was Resident Evil with dinosaurs, Parasite Eve 1 and 2 that mixed survival horror with RPG, Dark Messiah, Galerians, Evil Dead, Hail to the King, and so much more that made the PS1's library one of a kind. Each of these survival horror games has puzzle solving to make sure that it's not going to be easy to get to location. This adventure element would irritate players because of hard thinking and getting to one area to the next to solve a puzzle just to continue your quest rather than having a lot of scares. If you're not really good with adventure games or solving puzzles, then you will get bored and frustrated because of being stuck in one area. There are tons of items to find and collect as they go in your inventory and use them for various situations, but if you're good at solving puzzles, then prepare yourself for the horrors that lies beyond unlocking the puzzle. I'm for this puzzling element, not because I love adventure games, but it's a build up to the scare beyond what's stopping you from the puzzle. But what separates this genre from being a horror adventure is the ability to defend yourself with guns and other weapons that your character can wield. And trust me, you need it in order to survive due to the fact that the enemies have more HP and can cause more damage than you do, depending on what weapon you have. Some survival horrors have save points to find, like the typewriters in Resident Evil. Classic survival horror is most known for pre-rendered backgrounds where it's not 3D like everything moving you see, but has detailed design looking like a painting where you can move to another location or an angle by simply making the character to walk to another door, staircase, or step in a certain location to get to a different angle and journey on to your quest hoping that there won't be anything trying to kill you. This contrasts to older survival horror titles which use such camera angles throughout the entire game. With the fixed camera angles, you'll never know what to expect at another angle viewpoint, which makes the intensity even higher. On your journey, you can sometimes stumble across finding notes telling the player what has happened, what you should be aware of, and more stuff that should be helpful. This creates more attention of the atmosphere to become more intimidating, as it's questionable who made these notes. Then in 1999, a new and innovative survival horror was Konami's Silent Hill. Rather than using pre-rendered background and fixed camera angles where the character has to get from one end to the screen to get somewhere, everything was 3D in Silent Hill. This way you can move around with a camera following you, which makes traveling in Silent Hill less frustrating and occasionally switches to other angles for dramatic and disorienting effect. Silent Hill made environments more diverse with lighting effects and innovate a narrative adventure, as wherever Harry Mason ends up, it was part of the story. Most of all, this was terrors and frights that never explained the evils that came forth of the town of Silent Hill. with so much mindfuck moments and unanswered questions, which became a subgenre of survival horror called psychological horror, which focuses on new scares, getting puzzled and horrified beyond the things trying to kill you. At the same time, Silent Hill kept the adventure and puzzle-solving elements from all survival horror games. Then the PS2 was launched, and new survival horror games fully in 3D came and brought new scares at a new level, with Silent Hill 2 and 3 returning to the town with new main characters, Fatal Frame 1 and 2, a unique survival horror which photographs ghosts as the only defense, and so much more. With horror games getting popularized, the GameCube had Resident Evil remakes that were meant to scare players who weren't scared of the original trilogy, and the most underrated Nintendo and Silicon Knights' Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, with the innovative mindfucking sanity effects. Oh god, the sanity effects. And the Xbox had Bethesda's Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, a thrilling first-person survival horror, and everything else that was also on the PS2. Survival horror is a great video game genre, but I did interview some people why they did not like classic survival horrors, even though they liked horror movies and video games, and their problems with these games which made them alienate the genre. First being that if you're not good with adventure games, you will be frustrated with having one aspect being scared and the other moment of having the build-up solving these puzzles. I don't have a problem with that at all, since I do love adventure games, but what I do have a problem, however, is having games like Siren for the PS2, where there's too many puzzles, items that I don't know what the hell it is, and some puzzles that are impossible without a guide or a walkthrough online, and I, as well as most people, hated that. And it's even worse when there are survival horror games that has too much build-up with puzzle solving, and once you get past through that puzzle, you feel cheated that there's no scares, and sooner or later, you'll end up to another puzzle hoping that this part of the game will be worth it by having some fright that will haunt you. Most of all, what many dislike about the genre is the controls, which is the hallmark of classic survival horror. Basically, the way you move is press left and right to turn around, and press up to move forward in that direction you turn, and down to move backwards, and press and hold the run button to sprint. And it's even worse when the character turns slowly. I do admire the fact that you can defend yourself with the weapons you wield, but it's a little too much when you can't move your character when using a weapon, and it's pointless to have a short-range weapon like Chris Redfield's knife. Well, if you're gonna say, well, it has to be bad controls, otherwise the game wouldn't be scary, I'm gonna say in Resident Evil's case, since there's so many monsters in the series, if the controls were better, then it would be too easy and not that scary. But for the controls for Eternal Darkness, however, does not make your character turn left and right, but rather the character follows the direction that you aim your analog stick. Most of all, the combat mechanics are really incredible for a survival horror, as you have a unique targeting system wherever you want to hit your enemy. It's probably the only survival horror that doesn't have the same control and combat mechanics like to other survival horror titles, but still manages to scare the living shit out of me with the sanity effects. In fact, it could have been what survival horrors would have been if it were successful. But Eternal Darkness wasn't a commercial success, Nintendo abandoned the series, Silicon Knights stopped making the sequel, and Go for Too Human? Lame. And thus we would have to look for another game that would change the controls for the survival horror genre, which you will find in part 2. So please stay tuned for more of this episode of Video Game Genres.